So this presentation is a try, and it is constituted by four different projects actually. It's a kind of amalgamation of four kind of articles that I have been working at the same time. One is this, it's part of the general thinking about this early modernity, the global early modernity, and how can we understand this big global Mongol reshuffling, if you like, in the 13th, 14th centuries, the long-term implications of the Mongols in Eurasia. This is one thing. The other is the Ottoman spatial history that I'm going to talk on that, and the making of this imperial topology, imperial space. And the third study is on the very different Ottoman elites and capital accumulation, and Ottoman power of culture, cultural power, sorry. And the fourth study, which is part of that talk, is on Crimea. So basically you have four very different themes. Somehow, I try to combine these themes in this talk and try to do something interesting. The argument of the paper, there are basically three arguments. The first argument is Ottoman, what I call Ottoman radicalism. So how radical was the Ottoman Empire when it started? I argue that it was pretty radical, both in terms of its institutional structure, as well as the way that the Ottomans themselves placed it in the general global history in the 16th century. So I argue that there was very awareness, a kind of conscious position by certain Ottoman intellectuals that the creation of the Ottoman imperial enterprise was a very radical thing, and it was disruption from the past. So there was this clear consciousness about that Ottoman Empire was a new space and a new time. So this is one of the arguments. A spatial and historical self-awareness that this new order under the Ottoman regime was a radical rupture from the old world, to a new age, new space, new order, which was radically different from the old Islamic Chinggisid Greco-Roman. The second argument is the connection with the connection with the Turco-Mongolian tradition. So the argument is that although the Ottoman system, Ottoman Empire, was created in the general cultural landscape of Turco-Mongolian tradition in the 15th century, it also respond to that, and it was also a kind of a rupture to this Turco-Mongolian tradition. It was a conscious rupture, conscious revision, refusal of this Turco-Mongolian global political culture which dominated Eurasia for 200 years in the 13th, 14th centuries. And the third argument, the Ottoman system, both in terms of institutions and space, and also its narratives about history, were organized, consolidated in the 15th century and early 16th century, but these were not the only conventions. In fact, the ability and interest that the Ottomans to monopolize both the narrative and institutions and spatial structure of the empire were constantly challenged by other actors, other institutions, other spatial configurations. So it sounds a little complicated, and we'll come to that. Now let me read part of this, part of my working on progress article, let me read kind of introduction and then I will start speaking again. The Mongol globalization, as many world historians have recently emphasized, reshuffled the Eurasian system in the 13th and 14th centuries. It gave birth to new political institutions, forms of legitimacy, sense of geopolitics and imperial space, and art and architecture. Various lifestyles of nomadic, sedentary, urban, and literal communities were profoundly interacting in the large Mongolian earthquake and its later tremors. The revival of the Silk Road as the principal highway connecting the east and the west, south and the north of Afro-Eurasia coincided with the proliferation of far-flung networks conveying goods, ideas, and styles, moving from one region to another, one climate to another, and under the yasa of the Mongol law, yasa or the Mongol law. The brutality of the first stage of the conquest gave way to new forms of power and legitimacy which were carefully engineered by the existing local collaborators. The breakup of the Mongol Empire into 4 parts and the localization of the Mongol elites in their respective regions in China, Central Asia, in the northwestern steppes, and the broader Khorasan and Iran did not result in the disintegration of the economic and cultural space that they facilitated. The global moment of the Mongol Empire enabled Marco Polo to travel from Italy to China, but it also triggered the migration of bubonic plague from Inner Asia to Europe, although this theory was revised recently, which caused the biggest human disaster as a result of an epidemic in the world's history. The Chinggisid invasion of the Muslim lands in the 13th century following the ongoing shocks of the Crusades profoundly changed the political and economic culture of the Muslim world. The Muslims, who had been the central actors of Eurasian trade systems since the rapid expansion of the Muslim empires, now were provincialized in the new geopolitics of the Mongolian ecumenical design. While central China, the patrimony of the great Khan, ascended as the heart of the Mongol realm, the Ilkhans established control in Iran, Khorasan, and Asia Minor, and the Golden Horde Empire claimed the endless steppes to the north of the Black Sea. Despite this radicalism of the conquest, the localization of the Mongol military elites in their respective regions was not unexpected. Within 100 years, although the Mongol connections and institutions that had come with them did not evaporate, the elites were integrated into the local high cultures as patrons. While the Mongol elites clustered around the Great Khan gradually were integrated into Chinese high culture and Confucianism in the West, the Ilkhanid ruling elite, after flirting with Nestorian Christianity and Tibetan Buddhism, converted to Islam. The Ilkhanids were followed in the conversion to Islam by the house of the Golden Horde. Likewise, the Muslim movement did not eradicate the established Islamic institutions and memories. The process of maturation of Sunni Islamic law in the Seljuk era sponsored colleges just before the Mongols was not cut off. The Chinggisid Yasa, however, was now merged with Islamic legal institutions. Mongolian and Turkish became, with Arabic and Persian, overriding languages. While workshops and artists found new possibilities to travel from China all the way to frontiers of the Mongol world, the interactions between Islamic and the East Asian art enhanced the styles of the visual representations. But perhaps the most substantial change was in the reference of legitimacy. The lineage of Genghis Khan became the new reference for legitimate rule, pressing the prestige and power, overshadowing the Islamic legitimacy claims derived from the direct lineage, Ahl al-Bayt, clan, Hashim, or tribe, Quraysh, of Muhammad. The Muslim historians wriggled out to find an appropriate language to reconcile the brutality of the Mongolian conquest as it's epitomized in the destruction of Baghdad in 1258 with the fact that Ilkhanids were now the new patrons of the Muslim world. While Rashid ad-Din, the famed historian of the Ilkhanid court, amalgamated the narrative of Islam with Chinese and Mongolian historiographical tradition in his Jami al-Tawarikh, Jalal-ad-Din Rumi interpreted the transformation of the Mongols from their brutal pagan character into Muslim patrons in an alchemical fashion, called just as when gold is produced through alchemy, when it became gold, what was copper it now copper in, it now no longer remains. All of it becomes gold. So it's like a transmission of copper to gold. The Mongols became Muslim. The assimilation of the Mongol elites into the deep cultural ocean of the Islamic world did not result into a restoration of pre-Mongol conditions. New actors, claims, institutions, representations, and narratives unleashed with the Mongol moment reorganized the post-Mongolian parameters. In fact, in spite of the humiliation of the Seljuk Turks in their defeat against the Mongols, the real beneficiaries of the Mongol invasion were the other Turkish-speaking tribes, who were co-opted to the Mongol expansion and participated in the colonization of the Islamic lands. Within the Mongol space, the ceaseless immigration of the pastoral and semi-pastoral Turks from Central and Inner Asia dramatically augmented. The pastoralist warriors pouring into the sedentary and rural landscapes of the Eastern Mediterranean and later into India were attracted by the new opportunities of reallocating wealth and power in the post-Mongolian Islamic world. Do not cultivate a vineyard, you will be bound. Do not cultivate grains, you will be ground. Pull the camel, herd the sheep, a day will come, you will be crowned. While this anonymous Turkish poem echoes possibilities of power and wealth for the nomads, the nomadic warriors needed partners to give meaning to their enterprises. Actually, the dazzling fertility of the post-Mongolian Islamic landscape for the pastoral and semi-pastoral power entrepreneurs also supplied new potentials for Sufi saints and scholarly circles that provided spiritual and ideological service. With the help of the holy man and scholars, the new lordships were equipped with various references of versions of Islamic holy war or Chinggisid justice, or in some other cases to fabricated imputations such as the mythical Oghuz Khan of the Turks. The plurality of political and ideological references from the symbolic thesauruses in Islamic landscape enabled the power entrepreneurs to test different combinations, invent different historical narratives and epics, and market them to their peers and the urban and rural masses. The ethos of holy war, in other vein, provided further prestige and reputation, motivation, a sense of existence for those in the frontier zones of Islam and Christianity in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the northern steppes, in the frontier region of Islam, and the frontier regions of Islam and Hindu traditions in India. As a result, when we come to the 15th century, various old and new, Chinggisid and Turkic, dynastic and collective, pastoral and sedentary, land-based and littoral political formations were being constructed. They competed through various claims and justifications. 4 of these dynastic political enterprises will be particularly successful in consolidating their power, uniting or eliminating their coalition partners, and formed very successful empires: the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Baburs, the Mughals, or the Shaybanids, or the Uzbeks. In the late 14th century, after the aftershocks of the Mongol reshuffling were still profoundly felt. Amir Timur, who was a Turkish marshal marrying a Chinggisid princess, intended to revive the Chinggisid Empire by quick sweeping of the Muslim lands from Central Asia to Asia Minor. He eliminated or humiliated the power entrepreneurs who had just started to build their political establishments and invented their lineage narratives and epics such as the Ottomans. The Ottomans had gained a significant prestige in the Muslim world during their successful campaigns against the Byzantine and Serbian empires. They had constructed a fairly functional feudal system on the 2 sides of the Dardanelles, with the exception of Constantinople, which was constituted by a coalition of Muslim and non-Muslim warrior families who acted under the command or supervision of the Ottoman family. The defeat and humiliation of the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid against Timur was followed by a fragmentation of the young state. However, the Ottoman enterprise, much to the surprise of many contemporary observers, was not obliterated. On the contrary, it reasserted itself after a short time of civil war among the sons of the Bayezid. In fact, it was Timur's empire which would disintegrate soon, but not that the Ottomans. The reason of this longevity was a big lesson that the Ottomans had learned from the disintegration of the Mongol Empire. The realm should not be divided among the princes. as it was the case in the Turco-Mongolian tradition, but was kept in integrity in spite of the will of the heirs of the crown. For the sake of the welfare of the realm, the prince who happened to become the sultan was allowed to execute his brothers. The principle of fratricide was formulated in the imperial code of Mehmed II almost immediately after the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. Quote, "Whoever will inherit the crown among my descendants, it is permissible for him to execute his brothers for the sake of the order and of the realm." The ulama had their consent to this. Let them act accordingly. This radical principle was unimaginable in both Islamic and Mongolian political theory. Neither the theories referring to Muhammadan and Qurayshi lineage, nor those theories referring to Chinggisid lineage for legitimate authority cared so much about the integrity of the realm. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in the 1453 was a world historical event and gave not only an immense prestige to Mehmed II, but also a capacity for taking very radical and unprecedented steps. The radicalism of the code signifies a new age, which perhaps corresponds to our periodization of the end of the medieval and beginning of early modern, when territorial integrity, the indivisibility, territorial integrity and indivisibility increasingly received a high priority in constitutional theory. The consolidation of the Safavid, Mughal, and the Uzbek empires in the 15th and early 16th centuries followed the Ottoman enterprise had parallel stories, yet with considerable discrepancies. The Safavid and other Turkic dynasties started their career as a holy family in the Lakshi zone of Khorasan and gradually developed popularity among several Turkish tribal and semi-nomadic communities in Iran and Asia Minor who were truly disappointed by the radical elements of Ottoman Empire building. They combined spiritual claims with temporal ones, merged some elements of Twelver Shiism with the political symbolisms left from Sasanian legacy, which had never been forgotten in Persian circles. The Mughals, after the founding father of dynasty, Babur Khan, moved into a deep lands of India, claimed Chinggisid and Timurid legitimacy, and like the Ottomans, merged the idea with the ethos of holy war. The Kipchak steppes north of Black Sea, namely the patrimony of the former Golden Horn from Volga Basin to the Jangirian Gate. However, several Tatar, Uzbek, Kazakh, Turkmen tribal formations competed with the claims for the Chinggisid legacy after the drastic collapse of the Golden Horn and failed Timurid restoration. Eventually, the Shaybanids, in the line descendants from Jochi, the eldest son of Genghis Khan, were able to establish a coalition spread out Central Asia. Similarly, on the north of Black Sea and Khazan, other Chinggisid dynasties such as Gerais of Crimea claimed Jochi's patrimony. Like the others, these Chinggisid dynasties combined several references of legitimacy and special claims through Mongol and Islamic political vocabulary. Perhaps we can add to this post-Mongolian empire building orgy the Ming Empire of China and the Moscovit state, which would morph into the two largest land empires of Eurasia in later period. While the dynasties picked different titles among Islamic, Sassanid, Chinggisid, even Roman references, perhaps it was the Ottoman sultans who were the most generous with themselves in taking the titles of Sultan, Padishah, Caliph, Khan, Caesar, you name it, at the same time. But perhaps the most significant difference between the medieval and early modern realities of imperial governance was the sense of spatial political space. The political elites of the Ottoman, Safavid, and the Mughal empires had much more clear ideas about the lands that they controlled as sovereign powers than the medieval Islamic polities, the Mongol Empire, and to a certain extent to their post-Mongolian Chinggisid counterparts in Central Asia. The loose conception of Dar-al-Islam, the abode of Islam, a cultural and the legal integrity with the multiple polities in Abbasid and post-Abbasid world, and the Mongol sense of almost endless space, as much as the Mongols' armies could reach, and without exception of governing them permanently gave way to a sense of territorial empire, which, with legal and administrative mechanisms and with relatively clear boundaries. While frontiers gave way to borderlands, communities with multiple loyalties were less and less tolerated. Islamization of non-Muslims was not a pressing agenda for these polities. However, imperial elites intended to standardize and impose their preferred versions of Islam, preferably repeatedly through different brutal and subtle campaigns, as it was the case during the Ottoman and Safavid competition in the 16th and 17th centuries. The sense of territoriality does not mean that these empires were able to establish a monopoly over violence or mechanisms of unconditional loyalty. The early modern empires allowed co-opted, negotiated, suppressed, or eliminated the central and regional elites in different scales. In fact, all these political enterprises started as collective projects of conquering warriors and holy men who acted in partnerships. However, gradually they transformed into a dynastic states with a strong central government and sense of centralized authority and loyalty on different scales and more clear ideas about territory and territorial integrity. Okay, so this is kind of a long introduction. And to understand the Ottoman radicalism in that large context that I have described, I looked at three things. One is genealogical politics. The other is territorial space or spatial organization of the empire. And the third is the elite formations. Let me make it very simple. The genealogy. When you look at the Ottoman narratives from 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, at the beginning there was this obsession, almost an obsession, to find a good genealogical line. It can be biblical, it can be Alexander the Great, it can be Chinggis Khan, not very likely because nobody would buy it. Oghuz Khan, a fabricated hero, but something, a genealogical, kind of connection. Whenever Istanbul, Constantinople was conquered, stop. That moment, the genealogical references, almost the Ottoman imperial elite, they freed themselves from genealogical politics of Eurasia. This was quite radical. And following Mehmed the Conqueror in the 15th century, like mid-15th century onwards, gradually the Ottoman intellectuals, historians referred Mehmed the Conqueror and Osman, the founder father. It was almost like a new perspective, a new beginning of the time. The Ottomans didn't need any reference before the Ottomans. Ottoman Empire was the beginning of the new time. They didn't, they not only freed themselves from this larger Eurasian genealogical politics of Chinggisids, of the Muhammadans, and of others, they also presented, when you read this major texts, presented themselves as the beginning of this new space and new time, a new genealogy. Then I looked at territorial space. Mid-15th century, just before the conquest of Constantinople, we sense that Ottoman historians, we know this very well actually, this is very well studied, that Ottomans, the central administration, sent scribes and they call land scribes, to conquered areas. İlyazıcısı in Turkish. These people went to the conquered lands. They look around. They look at the topography. They talk to the notables of the conquered whatever town, land, and so on. And they started to write everything down. They wrote down the names of the households, individual households. Thousands of names, imagine. Names of the households. If it's not a household, if somebody is a bachelor, just they wrote his name. They wrote the names of the villages and towns. Sometimes they Ottomanized this language, if it's like Serbian, they wrote down all these boundaries. Which village belonged to which, under which city, and kind of like this whole administrative topology. This was very interesting. Normally, for many years, Ottoman historians work on these registers, one of them. And we looked at all kind of administrative structure, we asked questions about administration, we asked questions about demographics, but we never asked questions about its spatial implications. In fact, what happened in the 15th century onwards, the Ottomans, they almost colonized all this imperial space, and they codified it, they registered it, and they fixed it. After these documents, these are the names of the households and the taxes and dues. Some of them are local, some of them imposed by the empire. After writing down, codifying the names, the boundaries, the borders, which town belonged to which kind of jurisdiction area. After fixing them, these documents became not only descriptive but prescriptive. They became laws. From that on, and they also put a long introduction about the provincial regime, the legal, it explains the moment of conquest as the new start. It's almost like a revolution. The moment, it explained the conquest, and then what happened, who was the scribe, and how these negotiations with the local communities came into being. And then, whenever these were written down, that's it. Then these texts became laws. And they did it more or less. So these are the central lands. Do I have my, no. Okay, so they did it in tens of different provincial units. Not everywhere, but 80% maybe of the provincial units, they had these registers, codifications. As I said, they describe the taxes, demographics, names of the settlements, but also all kind of border relations, border lines. Some of these units were bundled with others and were created as jurisdictions, different jurisdictional units. So both here a fiscal but also spatial topology of the empire. This was quite radical, and in fact, most of the time, both in the Balkans and Anatolia, peasants knew that this is dangerous because things were fixed at that moment. So these negotiations, these early negotiations, were so dramatic. You are, some losers, some will lose, some will win, right? Every negotiation. So after that moment, things are, this is it. So these documents were sent to Istanbul as the laws. So whenever there was a change, this change can only be possible with a sultanic degree, sultanic authority. So this idea of starting the conquest, start a new moment. It's a start of a new history, new time, but also new space. New spatial organization, new spatial order was quite dramatic, and it was overall covering the central lands in the Balkans and Anatolia of the empire. Two things are very interesting here. One, we know from Doomsday Book, right? When the Normans conquered Britain, they had also similar land codes. So these are not unknown. What is dramatic here? The settlements and the communities and the names of the regions they were separated from the ruling elite. So for the ruling elite, so-called like prebend holders, the fief holders, the ruling families who were going to administer as office holders, for them, they created another register. So their names, the ruling family's names were not included into the main text. So that was this very interesting distinction between the administrative topographic or spatial administrative codes and the imperial ruling hierarchy. They were separated. So it was quite anti-feudal in many ways. The ruling elite and the space, the ruling elite and the land were divided. And we know that these fief holders, we can call fief holders or prebend holders, if you will, they lost their hereditary status. This was also quite radical. So in some cases after the conquest, some of these landholders were, they were implanted by the Ottomans. But some, just in fact local families who were collaborating with the Ottomans. And they were included in these registers, the registers that the second registers, who had the list of the office holders. But then we know that gradually they lost their hereditary status. The second dramatic thing is the scale. It's not the communities, it is the households who are listed. Peasant households, hundreds, thousands of households were listed in these registers. Imagine this information gathering in like 50, 60 years during after the conquest of Constantinople. This information gathering from the Balkans to East Anatolia about the land that the Ottomans claimed to rule. Individuals, families. The scale, it's like we can refer James Scott seeing like a state. Like the Ottomans, they created their own way of seeing like this whole provinces in a very like micro level. The spatial ordering of the Ottoman state in the 15th and 16th centuries were different from the imperial space cities and where the cities and communities were connected to the imperial center and among each other through diverse ties. Here we see rather an orderly and hierarchical divisions of provincial regions rather than towns with borderlands in an integrated territoriality where sovereignty was not divided. This third one, okay, the first one was genealogical politics. The second one was radical spatial reconfiguration, reordering of the empire. The third one is the elite formations. So the Ottomans started as a collective venture, like in Bay Area. Like, so lots of warrior families looking for wealth and glory. They acted in the frontier zone between the Islamic world and the Christianity, if you will, in this area in the 14th century, the Byzantine and Islamic world. And then they were the warriors, they were Ghazi families, like they are doing like holy war, but at the same time a little bit business, because when they establish something, they also benefit from it. So these were the collective ventures. What happened after mid-15th century, there was another radical condition. The first thing Mehmet the Conqueror did was he executed his Grand Vizier. The first thing after the conquest of Constantinople, he executed his Grand Vizier, who was in a way the leader of these families, if you call Turkish aristocracy, warrior aristocracy. The first thing he did is execute him. The second thing he did, confiscated his property. And he tested what happened, and that was not a big reaction. Then the second Grand Vizier, he executed and confiscated. The third Grand Vizier executed, confiscated. Then there was some reaction. He died. Second, Bayezid II, his son, came to power. First thing he did, actually, he gave this money back to the heirs of these people. Especially the first Grand Vizier who was executed, Chandarlar. But he also executed a couple of them. Meanwhile, there was this new system of recruiting soldiers that non-Muslim families living in the Ottoman Empire, they were a lot, the Ottomans took one of their sons as levy, as a tax, and then this son converted into Islam, and then he was trained as a soldier. So there was also very interesting recruitment policies from non-Muslim populations, and these people were in a way considered as the slave of the Sultan. So gradually, Mehmed the Conqueror and the other sultans, they put these guys, the converts, into power, and gradually eliminated the other warrior families. So when we come to the early 16th century, we see that most of these warrior families were marginalized, either executed or killed, or just marginalized in their far provinces. And the converts became like they're the unconditional servants of the Sultan. They're loyal. At least they were considered as such, and they can be executed, and their property can be confiscated because they're slaves. No, in fact, in the Islamic law of slavery, you cannot execute your slave. I mean, you cannot do it. So it's more than, it's beyond the limits of the Islamic law of slavery. But then gradually, this convention became, or this practice became the convention. When we come to the mid-16th century, the convention was whoever accept an office from the Sultan, or happen to be an office holder. Office also means revenue. This person also automatically stripped from his personal rights over his life and over his property vis-a-vis the Sultan. The Sultan had this full authority to execute this person without any due process, without any legal justification, and he can confiscate his property, again, without any legal justification. This practice became a common convention in the 16th century, and it continued until mid-19th centuries. It was very interesting. It was a contained violence. On the other hand, there was a very well-functioning Islamic legal system, but for the office holders, for this imperial elites, it's a very interesting thing. You're being an imperial elite, it was a big risk. You should be a big kind of a risk manager. It's very risky. You can get extremely powerful, wealthy, but you can lose your life in 2 seconds. So you see a kind of very interesting culture of power, consolidated in the Ottoman Empire about these elites, and the imperial elite and the others, the aristocratic elites, if you like, they somehow lost their centrality and they were marginalized. It doesn't mean that they totally disappeared, but they were marginalized, and the central elite, imperial elite, became in a way, constituted by these people who accepted this condition. So these radical things that I looked at, and these are different projects, as you see, different, especially the last one that I mentioned is going to be my second book, but this I looked at, the capital accumulation, confiscation mechanisms and whatnot. I don't want to get into detail. When we come to the mid-16th century, the Ottoman intellectuals, they understood. They had this awareness about this, what I call radicalism of what they are doing, in both spatial organization of this elite formation and about also this genealogical politics. And then how do they look at Asia? What is their perception about Asia? If they started a new life, a new time, a new history, a new space, a new culture, political culture there, how do they see the Asia? So one text that I've been working on, the Yaycioğlu, the late 16th century historian, who wrote about Eurasian history. And this text gives a good perspective about the Ottoman perception about the Eurasian world. So basically, he argued that Eurasia is the central Eurasia, is a Chinggisid ocean, the 16th century. All kind of tribes, hundreds of tribes, he named them, claiming Chinggisid legacy, Chinggisid lineage. They're competing for glory and power to rule over cities, not the regions. And it was so dynamic, it was so chaotic and nomadic. All kind of things going on there. He mentioned, all these tribes' names, give their names, and how they shift and power shifts, whatnot. And this Eurasian world at the middle were circulated by these other formations: Ottomans, Safavids, Mughals, and Ming, China, he said. And these are quite different. He said one quote, "The Ming could not control the lands of the Kalmucks, the Chinggisid tribes of the Eastern Asia. The soldiers of the Ming were slow, since they had firearms and artilleries, while the Kalmucks were the fast and uncontrollable, similar to the Crimean Tatars." That will come to that. So that was very interesting, kind of perspective that Seyfi Efendi presented the nomadic steppes of Eurasia as a different regime. Some of these groups were Muslim, some of them are not. But all are Chinggisid. The difference was not too much between the non-Muslims and the Muslim polities. It was between the Chinggisid nomadic and the land-based empires. So he just basically proposed another differentiation, another division, another categorization of 16th century world. On the one hand, you have these land-based empires, from Ming to the Ottoman Empire. On the other hand, you have this big Chinggisid ocean. The descendants of Genghis Khan, quote, were in several subgroups. The Padishah of Crimea were known as Tatar Khan. The outside of Deshti Kıpçak were the Shaybanids. The Bukhara was under the rule of the Uzbeks. The Kashgar were the Mongols. On the border of China were the Kalmucks. They were all Chinggisids. They were all sovereign, since Genghis Khan divided the realm among their sons. All were expressed in detail in the law of the Cengiz and the Cengizgname. The Ottoman principle of fratricide, killing your brother, and indivisibility of the realm was antithesis of the Cengizid political culture. The fact that the Ottomans freed themselves from the genealogical politics after the conquest of Constantinople disconnected them from the vibrant Cengizid claims of Eurasia. But not only that, the tribal fluidity and nomadic unruliness and constant movement in Eurasian steppes were very much the opposite of what the Ottomans tried to establish. Although the nomadic memory and ethos was never forgotten, the Ottomans built a different time and space. The Cengizid Eurasia represented not only another world, but also a world which was left behind, almost like an ancien regime. You have the similar depictions in other sources about Eurasia. Okay, now, last part of the... do I have how many minutes? Okay.
10 more minutes.
Good. So this is Black Sea. So Ottoman Empire is here. This is Crimea. And this whole area, the Volga Basin, and this whole area called, in the Mongol vocabulary, Deshti Kıpçak, the lands of Kıpçak, the steppes of Kıpçak, Kıpçak Empire. Kıpçak Empire refers to Golden Horde. And Moscovits, Russia, north, there's another, it's clear here. All right. Lithuania, Polish Lithuania, this is like the 18th century. And the Russian Empire was not as big then. I mean, now we are in the 16th century. So this is Crimea. So in 15th century, something, after, again, Constantinople is a very important landmark, but in 1475, we had this very interesting agreement between Mehmet the Conqueror and Mengli Geray. And Mengdigeray was the Khan, the ruler of the Crimean Tatars, who are connected to Genghis Khan through Georgi. They were around here, not including Crimea. And Mengdigeray and Mehmet the Conqueror agreed that for the Ottomans, Mengdigeray accepted Ottoman suzerainty. For the Crimeans, Mengdigeray and the Ottoman Sultan agreed on a partnership. So they have two different narratives. We don't have this agreement, but there are all kind of different stories about that. It's an epic moment, both for Ottoman history, but also for the Crimean history and for Eurasian history. Then on, Crimean Khans and Crimean aristocracy, which is very well established aristocratic, hierarchic, tribal group, they became part of this Ottoman integrity. That Crimean Khans were given this interesting status that they can use the title Sultan, sometimes even Padishah. They were considered for the Ottomans the second, like almost in the level of the Grand Vizier in the ceremonial. And they were very respected. There was one marriage between the Ottomans and Crimeans, only one. So they were in the Ottoman system. Some of them were granted some estates in Bulgaria. And still in Bulgarian parliament there are two Gerais actually coming from that line. Today even, because of this estates or farms. And they were respected, as I said. And the Ottoman attitude towards the Genghis Khan or Chinggisid legacy is kind of interesting because as we see, like in Seyfi, it is it's an old regime, but at the same time there was this also respect. I mean, Genghis Khan is Genghis Khan, right? I mean, we cannot really, For the Crimeans, it was a different story. When you read the Crimean histories, you have a different picture. They depict the whole situation in a very different way. They argue that, as I said, they're the partners of the Ottomans. They're equal. The Ottomans, in fact, made a big favor for them with this deal because it was a kind of a moment that they were fighting with the other Crimean, other groups, Chinggisid groups. So it was a good coalition. It was a good moment for them, and they made a big favor. So in a way, the Ottoman Sultan is somehow superior, but it's not like a vassalage, suzerainty kind of relationship. And most interestingly, they said, and when you read their text, they said their real land is not Crimea, but the whole Deshti Kipchak. They own Deshti Kipchak. The whole lands up to Russia. They think that this is their land. What does it mean, their land? They thought that this land were given to them by Genghis Khan, or this lineage, Georgi and the Golden Horde. So this is theirs, but this doesn't mean that they ruled this land. It's a different kind of understanding of space. It is not a territorial space. This is a land for raids, enslavement, plundering, hanging out, hunting. But this is not a land to rule. But this land belongs to them. It's a different idea of property, if you like. And there's, it can really refer to the medieval idea of like this hunting ground, and medieval, both in Islamic and in Roman tradition, the status of the hunting lands. Very, very similar. At the same time, there were all kind of different tribal groups in the area. Nogais, Kalmyks, you name it. The Kazan had this other family. Everybody claimed certain connection with Genghis Khan. Sometimes they are in coalition, sometimes not. Sometimes they were internal tribes. Sometimes marriages, very, very complex, as Seyfi described. But for them, it was almost like a bipolar situation. I mean, they lived in the Ottoman world, but they have a different horizon. And when they read their text, they constantly referred the time of Genghis Khan. For instance, they said, wow, this year we had this great raid. Let me, one nice quotation here. Where did I put it? One of the Khans gathered with all notable aristocrats in a big assembly and said, oh, the notable warriors, there are 2 seasons for our raids, either fall or winter. I hope we can have a start our raid soon and enjoy the Gaza. So they also refer this Gaza, the warrior, is like Islamic connection. So it's a kind of interesting amalgamation of Chinggisid and Islamic, What do you think? We can attack the Circassian lands, crossing the frozen straits, or we can jump on our horses and onslaught the Moscovits and destroy Russian lands. What do you think? And they said, the notables said, well, you are too busy for a while, so why don't you send your son? So it's kind of interesting, idea. The raid is a big part of it, but also there's one condition. I mean, if the communities, Russian communities or whoever, or Circassians gave certain dues, they can save themselves from the raids. So it's almost like a taxation. But it's a very different idea, as I said. So this situation is good also for the Ottomans for a while, although Ottomans had a very completely different idea of space, as I talked about. Here, it worked very well, because these lands are very unruly. So the Crimeans became like a buffer state. Very nice. Second, enslavement. They are the biggest provider of slaves for the Ottoman Empire. Biggest slave market, actually, Kefe. They all ship slaves here from Kefe to Istanbul. And even Süleyman married one of them. I mean, this is, it's a big market. Huge market. 80% of the Ottoman slaves came from through this, Crimean through the Crimeans. So whenever there was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, first the Poland and Lithuania, then the agreement, then the Russian Empire, Russian state, and before the Russian state, the Ukrainian Kazakhs created a kind of a territorial space. There were all kinds of different moments that the Russians and Ottomans started some negotiations. Ukrainians and Russians started negotiating. Poland and when there was war, that's fine, they were functional. But when there was trade and there was this territorial agreements between these Ottomans and the others, then gradually the Gerais became a problem, because they don't have any place in that kind of configuration. So in one of the, for instance, agreements between the Ottomans and the Russians, the Ottoman says, since the Russian Empire is a sovereign, independent state, the Tsar and his successors are no longer under the obligation to continue to pay the tribute which was paid to the Crimean Khan and the Crimeans until today. Neither the Crimean Khan nor the subjects, the Crimean and the Tatars, were to recommence their hostile acts under the pretext of demand for tributary, Chinggis tributary of any other excuse, but they were to respect the peace. So very, very interesting. We see that in 17th century onwards, kind of, if you like, territorializations. Very much like we talk the Westphalian state system, very similar, both in the north and the south. And gradually in that territorialization process, the whole Crimean, the Chinggisid, formations, somehow they lost their space. They lost their idea about, how they're gonna, somehow they were marginalized. And this created lots of tensions between the Ottomans and the Crimeans, as you can guess. And the problem is, Chinggis charisma was still very important. Yes, in the 17th century they are losing their importance, they are losing their space. But in the 17th century, in the Ottoman Empire, there was also lots of crises, lots of political crises, lots of rebellions, lots of riots. Everybody is very the situation is very shaky. Lots of criticisms to the Ottoman dynasty from different circles, including the office holders who are ready to, However, from the 17th century onwards, the Khans were increasingly incorporated into the Ottoman establishment. Most of the Girais came to spend time in the estate with handsome annual incomes in the Ottoman Balkans, waiting for their turn to become Khan. This coincided with the increasing involvement of the Ottoman center in the affairs of the northern frontier as a response to the consolidation of Russian Empire and the Kazakh formation. The persistent interventions of the Ottoman authorities in the affairs of the Crimea often irritated the Crimean elite, who thought that the Khans were, if not equal, subordinate peers of the Ottoman sultans. In the early 18th century, the Crimean historian Mehmet Geray, who was also from the Khanate family, openly criticized the Ottoman practice of constantly deposing the Khans without any excuse. He proposed that, quote, according to Muhammadan law, a Muslim emperor should not be deposed by another emperor. He should be investigated. If a fault was certain, he should be adjudicated according to the sacred law. So he's against the Ottoman constant deposition of the Khans. This was also the period when the Gerais were more frequently mentioned in the Ottoman circles as an alternative to the Ottoman dynasty. According to the 17th century Ottoman source, the challenge of a Geray Khan to an Ottoman sultan was depicted in a story that took place in an early 15th century. The Crimean Khan, according to that story, claimed the throne, Davai Saltanat, from the Ottoman Sultan Murad II, on the basis that the Chinggisid dynasty was older and therefore superior to the Ottomans. Instead, Murad, who intended to prevent a war between two Muslim emperors, proposed to the Khan a one-on-one wrestling match. Murad and the Khan were engaged in wrestling. The Ottoman Sultan beat the Chinggisid Khan and was able to keep his throne. According to Feridun Emecan, this story echoes the interregnum in the 15th century after the Timur defeated the Ottomans. However, it can also be understood as an evidence that the 17th century, the lineage of Chinggisids were considered as a competitor of the Ottoman dynasty in different circles. As far as we know, the Ottoman Central Authority never formally acknowledged the Gerais as an alternative to the Ottoman dynasty. However, in different sources, including some official chroniclers, there are bits of different anecdotes implying such a possibility. Particularly during the political crises and popular unrest, the possibility of replacing the Ottomans with the Gerais, Chinggisid Gerais, was openly voiced. If one reason for allowing for the possibility was the opposition to different Ottoman sultans or the court in general, another reason might stem from the fact that the male heirs of the Ottoman dynasty were always very few because of the earlier practice of fratricide. The possibility that the Ottoman lineage might die out must have kept the rumors referring to the Gerais as a substitute dynasty alive. According to an anecdote in 1614, Sultan Ahmed I went hunting. When he sent his falcon off, he saw another falcon snatching away the bird his falcon had intended to catch. He was told that the owner of the thief was Mehmet Geray, a Crimean prince, whom the Grand Vizier Nasuh Pasha then had invited to the hunt. The Sultan was told the Nasuh intended to replace Ahmed I with the Geray. The Sultan ordered to have Mehmet Geray imprisoned in Yedikule, the famous jail in Istanbul. He would escape 3 years later during the celebration of Osman II's accession and became the Khan of Crimea later. Around the same time, during the incidents resulting in the deposition and execution of Osman II in the Janissary-led riot in 1622, some sources recorded that the Grand Vizier Davut Pasha intended to extinguish the Ottoman family and put the Crimean Khan to the Ottoman throne. Again, in the 17th century, there was a rumor circulating that Murad IV, before dying, intended to execute his brother, Prince Ibrahim, the only heir to the throne, and enthroned either his close friend Mustafa Pasha or alternatively Bahadur Geray, the Khan of the Crimea. In 1640 and 41, Shahin Hauk, means Hauk Geray, was executed during his stay in Rhodes, according to an Ottoman chronicler, on the basis of a prophecy that somebody with the name of a bird would terminate the Ottoman dynasty. During the revolt which resulted in the toppling of Mehmet IV, it was recorded that some of the insurgents declared that wished to slay all the princes and members of the Ottoman household and replace the Ottoman dynasty with the Crimean Khans. During the same period, Niyazi Mısri, an ascetic Sufi sheikh, wrote his biographical Cri de Coeur. He said, "Before I die, let me tell my will. The throne belongs to the Tatar, Crimean Tatar. The throne belongs to the Tatar. The throne belongs to the Tatar. The throne belongs to the Tatar. The throne belongs to the Tatar. They, the Ottomans, failed to be corrected. They are like a rotten egg. There is no more godness in them. The throne will go to the Tatar." Misri saw the Gerais as true and just Muslim rulers who would replace the deviant Ottomans on the throne of the empire. Misri's remarks were uttered in an age when evangelical movements ostensibly challenged the religious orientations of the members of the imperial elite with claims of the lack of Muslim purity. In the late 18th century and early 19th centuries, we see other cases where some Gerais were seen as possible candidates for the throne of the empire. The shadow of Genghis Khan was rambling in the Ottoman world, resurfacing on different occasions when the fate of Ottoman dynasty was in jeopardy as a result of various political and dynastic crises. One last thing. Then Crimea was annexed by Catherine the Great in the 18th century, 1782, after the Ottoman-Russian War in 1770, ended in 1774. And the old Gerais, they immigrated to the Ottoman Balkans. They were not allowed to live in Istanbul. They were kept in the Balkans as a kind of a dynasty in exile kind of thing. But they were also mobilized against Russians by the Ottomans. One of them, Cengiz Mehmet Geray, kind of an unruly, and his name was interesting, Cengiz Mehmet Geray. So Mehmet, Muhammad, Cengiz. So he just combined Muhammad and Cengiz in his name. He was a big hero against Russians, but something happened that his estate was confiscated as a mistake by a governor that he had no idea. So he's very unhappy, very, very sad, and very, very angry. And he just, rebelled with some, he just gathered together some bandits, and he got rebelled. Then something happened. He was about to be caught, but he didn't. He was not. So he escaped to Russia. He lived in Russia for 7 years in the court of Catherine the Great. And then Tsar Alexander. According to Russian sources, he's also very much influenced by the liberal ideas of the French Revolution. I don't know if he's really reading Rousseau or something, but he's also like somehow part of this interesting culture, court culture of Russia during the time. Then he came back to Circassia, right here, to his godmother. His godmother, generally the Gerais sent their sons to Circassia for training. So during his stay in Circassia, he met with an Ottoman officers, and in the Ottoman officers he said that he's too bored in Russia. It's boring. So he wanted to go back to the Ottoman lands, and he was pardoned. He came to the Ottoman lands, but pardoned at one condition. He shouldn't go back to his estate, which was confiscated, because it was also like got by somebody else. So he wanted to get his estate. And this estate I saw actually that estate is nothing. I'm not very why he's so obsessed about that's not very clear. So on the way back, there was this unruly rebel right here in Bulgaria on the Danube, Pazvantoğlu. This is the time of Napoleonic Wars. Everything is very shaky. So he invited him to Geray, to Vidin. He was already a big rebel. The Ottomans couldn't defeat him. But he was pardoned. Pardoning, and this is very common practice in the Ottoman. So they lived in Vidin for a while, and they sent 2 letters, one to Tsar Alexander, the other to Napoleon Bonaparte. And we know only the one that he sent to Napoleon. He said, if France is interested in a kind of a partition plan, partition plans are very much around, right? Since 18th century, Poland was partitioned, and that was always planned. There were also plans that the Ottoman Empire will be partitioned. They said, if you're interested in a kind of partitioning the Ottoman Empire, Post-Mongol said, we might be interested in that project. And in fact, he said, we have one guy, he's Chinggisid. He can be, be part of that thing, and he can be the emperor of a puppet empire created by France, by Napoleon. All of a sudden, the Gerais and the whole Chinggisid name became a major actor in the whole revolutionary Europe, Napoleonic politics. Napoleon asked his Talleyrand about, make it all kind of research about what's going on, what's the story about this Gerais. And in one moment, implicit actually in the negotiation, said that do I have any Gerai that I can appoint to India? Thank you.